Several years ago, our son Stephen, who's our youngest twin, was diagnosed with Tourette syndrome. We had heard of it, not sure what it was. Simply, it's a disease, a neurological condition, where it's involuntary twitching. And his eyes began to twitch, and his neck, and his face contorting, and all sorts of little involuntary noises and kind of grunts and whines that he would make. And the doctors gave him some medication. Nothing really seemed to help. There's no cure to it, but a very awkward disease for someone that's a teenager and very self-conscious. And our son Stephen, of course, just loves the Lord with all of his heart. He's the type teenager. One day I walked into his bedroom and he was listening to a gospel CD. And I said, Stephen, that CD or that song doesn't sound very gospel. It sounds more country and western than it does gospel. And without an argument, immediately he just hit the button and popped the CD out and handed it to me. He said, there, Dad, just yield it. He's the type kid, if you went to his bedroom late at night, he'd be on his knees praying or his Bible open, maybe singing, reading scriptures. He's a good soul winner. And so several years ago, after he had developed this Tourette syndrome, we had a soul-winning marathon. Our youth director brought all of our teenagers out for a day and a half to do nothing but try to catch groups of children and groups of teenagers and adults in parks and lower-income neighborhoods and apartment complexes and basketball courts and try to see how many people they could see saved. And at the end of the day, I think we'd had over 100 people that had received Christ. So late that night, my daughter and son-in-law, who's our youth director, came in the door, and they were excited, telling me how many people got saved and who they won. And my son Paul, our other twin, came in and told us he had won some people. And Stephen walked in very quietly, walked right past us and into his room and closed the door. It was very cold. I could tell that it had not been a good day for him. And of course, he was probably discouraged. So after a few moments, I went into his room and found him laying on his bed, sobbing. I patted him on the back and I said, how'd it go today? He said, Dad, it didn't go very good. He said, I went out soul winning for 10 hours and did not lead anyone to the Lord. I gathered groups of people. I had 5 and 10 people to gather together and they were interested and wanted to hear how to be saved, but I began stuttering and my Tourette syndrome kicked in and I could barely even say the question, and I couldn't even get the question out. And they began laughing, and Dad, I didn't win anybody to the Lord. And his stuttering, of course, began getting worse during that time, and he would say, my name is Stephen. And he just couldn't get it out and couldn't keep the attention of people. And he was just heartbroken. I hugged him and our tears mingled, and I said, Stephen, if God wants you to win souls, He'll have to help you talk. That's God's business. We hugged and prayed, and the next day he led some people to the Lord. But it still wasn't over. About that time we had a contest in our church, gearing up for a big day, trying to get people to church. And Stephen came to me and said, Dad, our youth director announced a contest that whatever teenager brings the most first-time visitors for the next month would win a trip to Disneyland. And he said, Dad, with my Tourette's and my stuttering, it would be a miracle if I won that contest, wouldn't it? I looked at him and said, Stephen, it would be a miracle if you won that contest. He said, would you pray with me that I could win? He said, Dad, I don't need to go to Disneyland. We've been as a family many times. But I just believe that God would get all the glory if I won that contest. I said, Stephen, I'll pray with you about that. 4 weeks later, all the tallies were in. Stephen had brought 31 first-time visitors to church. He invited a friend to go to Disneyland with him, and guess what? He was a bus kid that also stuttered. About that time, my wife and I were thinking of ways to encourage our son, because it had been a long 2 years of this Tourette's and stuttering. We were in a married couple's getaway in Monterey, California about that time. Our son had just began painting. He had never taken lessons, and somehow he just had a real keen eye for art and began doing a few sketches. And his first oil painting was simply a copy of a calendar he saw, a Thomas Kinkade calendar. And we were just amazed how close it looked to an actual Thomas Kinkade painting. So while my wife and I were in Monterey one summer during a married couple's getaway, we walked into a Thomas Kinkade museum or art gallery and saw a lot of his works. Of course, we're very impressed. Thomas Kinkade, being the most famous painter in American history, has more pages describing him and his artwork in the Smithsonian Institute than any other artist, including Michelangelo, any of those guys. And we asked the manager of the art gallery if Mr. Kinkade ever came in Monterey in the gallery. He said, no, he doesn't. He's got galleries around the world. He said, but he does come into Monterey occasionally for a birthday celebration. And they were celebrating his birthday 3 months from then, which would be his 50th birthday. I said, what would it take for our son Stephen to be able to meet Thomas Kinkade? All we want to do is just try to encourage him and give him an opportunity to take a picture with him or shake his hand. And he said, well, this birthday event is open to 150 gallery owners and art collectors. And I said, so what do you have to do to go? He said, you have to be a gallery owner or art collector, or you have to buy one of Tom's high-end paintings in the next 30 days. And we looked around the gallery. We saw prices anywhere from $5,000 up to $150,000. I said, well, what is a high-end painting? And they said, well, anything from maybe $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. My wife and I kiddingly said, how many would you like to buy? And I said, you don't understand, sir. My son has Tourette syndrome. And we're just trying to encourage him. Is there any chance he could go just to meet Mr. Kinkade? The gallery owner said, of course he cannot, because it's open only to the art gallery collectors. And I said, well, is there any chance we could just meet him there? He said, no, it's invitation only. So I gave him my card and said, if there's any chance this would ever open up or we could go, please give me a call. He said, sir, it's a fundraiser and it's only those who buy in high-end painting. So about that time, I researched. I found a friend who had a Thomas Kinkade painting. So I called the gallery again and said, look, I've got a friend that has a high-end painting. And they said, sir, you missed the point. You have to personally buy the painting. The 30 days before the event, we have to have a record that you purchased it. I said, I see. I said, well, if there's any chance it would work out, would you please call me? He said, we will. 3 weeks later, we got a phone call from a sweet lady working for the Thomas Kinkade Gallery in Monterey. She said, Mr. Ray, we've got 3 tickets in the mail for you, one for your wife, and one for your son, Stephen. I said, ma'am, there must be a mistake. We did not buy Mr. Kinkade's painting. We didn't buy one of those paintings. We're not collectors. And she said, no, it's no mistake. I'm the event chairperson. I'm in charge of this birthday event. And I just thought it was the Christian thing to do to send you 3 tickets. I said, amazing. We rejoiced in what God had done for us. And at our son Stephen and Paul's birthday party, our son Paul got a nice gift. And to Stephen, we handed him an envelope, which was the actual invitation to Thomas Kinkade's 50th birthday party. He couldn't believe it. He was so excited, ecstatic. So finally came the day for us to drive down to Monterey. I called the day before and asked if we could bring Stephen's painting, his Thomas Kinkade look-alike, and would Mr. Kinkade maybe autograph it or sign the back. We were told that only those that bought an actual high-end painting that night, the night of the event, would get an autograph on the painting. I told the chairperson, well, we're going to bring it anyway. We walked into the event, and it was high class, first class, big fancy meal, decorations. It was a 50s theme. We sat down at the table just hoping to get a picture of Mr. Kinkade or wave at him or shake his hand. People at the table began talking. One couple said, we flew in from Dallas. for this event. We own 15 Kinkade paintings. Another couple spoke up and said, we came from Washington, D.C. for this event. We own 12 Kinkade paintings. The conversation finally came around to my wife and I, and they said, how many Kinkade paintings do you guys own? We looked at each other, smiled, and said, we have his calendar. We kind of felt like poor white trash among all the millionaires. We had name tags on that night, and we were surrounded by Kinkade paintings all over the room. It was just beautiful. My name tag, of course, said Pastor Ray. So all evening, people looked at me and said, are you Tom's pastor? You must be Tom's pastor. I said, no, I wish I was when he tithed, though. About the time the meal ended, Thomas Kinkade walked in the back of the auditorium on up to the platform. He began speaking. He said something like, thank you for making my birthday event. It's a very special occasion. Thank you for making me feel special. He held up his hands and said, my hands are a gift of God. I give all the glory to God. I'm called the painter of lights because He is the light of the world. He lives in my heart. And he just kind of sounded like a Baptist preacher for a few moments. I was videoing some of this, and in my heart I was saying, go Tom, go. We were smiling, just amazed at his testimony. About that time he sat down, and the event chairman of the night stood up and said, in a few moments, Tom is going to autograph any photographs or pictures that were purchased tonight. But before we do that, would Stephen Ray please come to the platform? We couldn't believe it. I was videoing at that time. Put the video on Stephen. His mouth dropped open. And the man says, and Stephen, please bring your painting to the front too. You could have heard a pin drop. We were just hoping to meet Mr. Kinkade. We didn't know Stephen would be asked to step on the platform. He came all the way up to the platform, and then the man in charge says, and Pastor, how about you and your wife come up to the front too? So we walked up to the front. I was videoing as much as I could, looking very awkward. I tried to video myself walking up the aisle. Finally, I set the camera down, and the chairperson said, Pastor, tell us why tonight is special. I took just a moment to just appropriately say, Stephen has Tourette syndrome. It's been a very rough year for him, and we're just thankful to be here. Thank you for allowing us to come. So about that time, they did the unthinkable. They handed the microphone to Stephen and said, Stephen, you say a word. And I was thinking, it's been a wonderful evening up till now, because I knew Stephen would start stuttering and wouldn't get a word out and would embarrass himself. But as Stephen held the microphone, he said something like, it is a great privilege to be here tonight. My name is Stephen Ray. This is the first oil painting I've ever done. Mr. Kinkade, you're my hero. He did not stutter one time. It seemed like the angels up in heaven began flapping their wings and helping him. The chairperson said, Stephen, hold up that first painting of yours. And as he held up his oil painting, people began to cheer and awe and began to take pictures. About that time, Mr. Kinkade looked around. He said something to the fact of, you're stealing the show, or it's my birthday, or you're taking over. And he actually held up the painting with Stephen, and people took pictures. And he said, Stephen, you stand right down here, and I'll be glad to autograph your picture. You be first in line. We just could not believe what God had done that night. About that time, after Stephen had his painting autographed, we took pictures. We walked back to our table, and Stephen said, Mom, did you get a picture of me with Mr. Kinkade? Did you get a painting of me, a picture of me shaking his hand? She said, Stephen, I got a picture of Mr. Kinkade shaking your hand. Because, Stephen, you have won more souls than Thomas Kinkade ever will. Only a mother could say that. And as we sat back at our table that night, there were people, the crowd came to our table to take pictures of Stephen. They wanted to take a picture of Stephen's painting. While it was Mr. Kinkade's birthday, Stephen was getting the attention. And I'm brought back to that verse that says, those who honor me, I will honor. And it looked like God looked down from heaven and said, I'm going to do something for this teenager who loves me with all of his heart. I'm going to do something for him. have never done for any other teenager. And that night, it seemed that God looked down from heaven and honored a boy that loved God with all of his heart. The Kinkade night, the Kinkade moment, we will never forget it as long as we live.